the corridor, his eyes never leaving the two of them, not out of suspicion, but because it was his job to watch anything out of place. And a 10-year-old girl screaming about poison plants in front of Mr. Caruso was the most out-of-place thing he had seen in 12 years there. Then the nursery door opened, and Dr. Whitfield stepped out. His face spoke before his mouth did. Pale, lips pressed into a hard line. A test report trembled slightly in his hand, a tremor he couldn't hide, because he was too shocked to remember to hide it. He small Emilio, and said, in the voice of a man whose professional world had just struck him across the face, oleandrin positive. Blood levels near cardiac arrest threshold. Silence fell. Not the empty kind, but the kind so heavy Willa could feel it pressing on her shoulders. 24 of the world's top doctors. More than 300 years of combined medical experience. Dozens of awards. Hundreds of cited papers. And not one of them had seen what a 10-year-old girl from an Appalachian valley saw at first glance. Dr. Whitfield didn't look at Willa. He couldn't, because looking at her meant admitting that 30 years of Johns Hopkins credentials and experience had just lost to the inherited knowledge of an old Appalachian herbalist, and his professional pride wasn't ready for that admission. It didn't matter anymore. Because inside the nursery, everything changed. The medical team immediately shifted protocol. Digoxin-specific antibody fragments administered intravenously, oleandrin detoxification initiated, cardiac monitors recalibrated to read the correct glycoside-induced arrhythmia instead of an unexplained heart failure, as they had for 12 hours. 45 minutes after the antibodies were given, Nico's heart rhythm began to stabilize. An hour later, the rash on his chest stopped spreading. 2 hours later, Nico's skin tone began to change, slowly, in small patches, like dawn, spreading across water, from bruised purple to pale pink, then warm pink, the pink of an 8-month-old baby who was alive, truly alive, no longer dying. Willa looked through the open door and saw Nico's chest rising and falling steadily, saw the tiny hand curl and uncurl, saw lips turning from purple to pink, and she drew in a breath so deep her lungs hurt because she hadn't realized she'd been holding it for 2 hours. Joe saw it too, and understood that her daughter had been right, that the knowledge Dot passed down wasn't superstition or backwardness, but something that had just kept a baby on the living side of the world. Then Emilio stepped out of the nursery for the second time that day, but the man who emerged was not the same man who had stepped out before. Before, he had been the Caruso boss controlling a situation. Now, he was a father who had just watched his son return to life, and the gravity of that moment was pulling him down. Emilio walked to Willa. The entire corridor held its breath. Paxton straightened. Dr. Whitfield looked from the doorway and turned away. And Emilio Caruso, Mafia Boss, the man the 5 East Coast families feared, the man who had never knelt before anyone, not even at his father's coffin, lowered one knee onto the cold marble floor before a 10-year-old night housekeeper's daughter. Knee to stone, the sound of expensive trousers brushing marble, his eyes level with Willa's, and he said, his voice hoarse, the voice of a man speaking through a crack in the wall he'd built for 8 months. You saved my son's life. Willa looked at her mother. Joe nodded faintly, lips trembling, eyes full. Willa looked back at Emilio and spoke softly, with a calm that seemed impossible for a child who had just endured what she had. In the voice Dot would have used if she were still alive, my great-grandmother taught me that if you know how to save someone, and you choose not to, you're no different from the one who harmed them. I only did what she taught me, whether that person ever sees me or not. The last sentence struck Emilio's chest in a place no bullet, no blade, no enemy had ever reached. Whether that person ever sees me or not. The girl had lived 10 years invisible on his estate, skirting walls, learning how not to make noise, and still chose to save his son without needing to be seen, without needing thanks, without needing reward. Emilio stood. He said nothing more, because he wasn't a man of many words. And now he knew even less what to say as the crack in the wall inside his chest spread wider than he wanted to admit. He turned back into the nursery and closed the door, and outside in the corridor, Joe Mercer held her daughter tightly on the cold marble floor and cried, silently, because Joe had learned long ago that crying out loud was a luxury reserved for people allowed to take up space, and she had never been allowed. Emilio didn't sleep that night. He sat in the basement office, the soundproof room no housekeeper was ever allowed near, with a glass of whiskey untouched on the desk and his laptop replaying every second of security footage from the past 3 days. In Emilio Caruso's world there were no accidents, no coincidences, No innocence without someone's hand behind it, and an oleander plant wrapped with a satin ribbon appearing in the nursery of the East Coast Mafia boss's son wasn't a gift. It was a death sentence wrapped in flowers. Emilio rewound the footage to Saturday, 3 days before Nico fell ill, and he saw it clearly. A white, unmarked delivery truck stopping at the side gate at 2:17 in the afternoon. A man in a florist uniform stepping down with the potted plant in his hands, exchanging a few words with the gate guard before being let in, walking straight to the nursery area and placing the plant on the windowsill, as if he knew exactly where it belonged. Emilio froze the frame, zoomed in on the deliveryman's face, and called Paxton in. Paxton looked at the screen for less than 5 seconds before saying a name they both knew. Grady, not a florist. Grady was a former runner in the Caruso network, the kind who handled jobs no one wanted to remember and no one was allowed to talk about, the kind who lived at the lowest tier of the system, took orders, carried them out, vanished, never asking why. But Grady had been cut loose 4 years earlier after skimming money from a Newark port operation, and he should have disappeared completely from Caruso territory unless someone inside the family had kept him close, fed him, and used him for a private purpose. Emilio asked Paxton who Grady had been working for over the past 4 years. Paxton didn't answer right away. He looked at Emilio with the eyes of a man weighing loyalty against caution, then said someone had seen Grady going in and out of Sal's house in Bridgeport at least 3 times over the past 6 months. He hadn't reported it because there was no order to monitor Sal. Salvatore Caruso. Uncle Sal, Giovanni's younger brother, 58 years old, the man who had stood beside Emilio at Giovanni's funeral, placed a hand on Emilio's shoulder and told him he wasn't alone, that his uncle would always be there. The man who had sat in the chair to Emilio's right at every family meeting for 8 years with a loyal face and eyes, Emilio now realized had never been loyal. Emilio ordered Paxton to trace the origin of the plant order. 2 hours later, the results came back. The flower company listed on the delivery invoice was Greenleaf Botanicals, registered in Stamford, Connecticut. Paxton sent people to check and found no such company at the address, only a second-hand shop that had closed last year. The phone number on the invoice was a disposable line, already disconnected. The name of the purchaser was John Davis, a name so common it meant nothing, impossible to trace. Everything was fake. Every trail had been wiped clean by someone who knew exactly how Caruso security worked, who knew the delivery screening procedures, who knew which camera covered which angle and which guard worked which shift, by someone who had lived inside the system long enough to know every weakness. Not an enemy from the outside, an enemy from within. Emilio closed the laptop. He didn't tell Paxton what he was thinking because in the underworld you don't strike until you're certain. You don't let prey know it's been scented. You wait, you watch, you gather until the picture is complete. Then you strike once and only once, because that strike has to be the last. The following afternoon, Salvatore Caruso came to visit Nico. He entered the estate, carrying a bouquet of white flowers and a face full of concern, wrapped Emilio in both arms, patted his back 3 times, and said in a trembling voice everyone assumed was emotion that he hadn't slept after hearing the news. Asking how the boy was and saying he'd come as soon as he could, Emilio returned the embrace and looked past his uncle's shoulder into empty space, his eyes cold as a frozen lake. He said Nico was out of danger, that doctors had discovered oleandrin poisoning from a plant in the nursery, and he watched. He watched Sal's eyes when he heard the words out of danger, and he saw it. A blink too fast. So fast most people would miss it. But Emilio wasn't most people. Emilio was a man who read others like books. That blink wasn't relief. It was surprise. Surprise that the child was alive. He watched Sal's hands when oleander was mentioned, and he saw it. Sal's left thumb tapped twice against his index finger, a familiar tick that always surfaced when Sal was under stress, a tick Emilio had seen 100 times at poker tables when Sal held a bad hand. Sal was tense. Not because he feared for Nico, because his plan had failed and he was calculating how much Emilio knew. Emilio knew enough. But not everything. He didn't yet know who Sal was connected to on the outside, didn't know how wide the network stretched, didn't know how many pieces were still on the board unseen. So Emilio smiled at his uncle, poured him a glass of wine, thanked him for coming, and walked him to the door with the flawless warmth of a man waiting for the right moment. When Sal's car disappeared beyond the gate, Emilio stood at the window watching and spoke to Paxton behind him, without turning around. Monitor every call, every meeting, every step he takes. Around the clock. Don't miss anything. News spread faster than fire through a house full of wind, and within 24 hours after Nico was out of danger, everyone in the estate knew, from the head chef to the gardeners to the night shift security team, that the night housekeeper's daughter had saved the Caruso heir by recognizing what 24 of the world's top doctors had missed. The story was told and retold in the kitchen, in the laundry room, in the security changing area, and each retelling added a new layer of drama. But the core never changed. The 10-year-old girl, Miss Mercer's daughter, knew about oleander because her great-grandmother taught her, and she had risked her life to run into the boss's nursery to say what she knew. Rumors at the Caruso estate never stayed inside the Caruso estate. They slipped out through back doors, through housekeepers calling family, through night guards texting girlfriends, through drivers talking to other drivers while waiting at gas stations, and they reached Salvatore Caruso's ears at his Bridgeport home before Emilio even decided how much Sal should know. Sal sat in his study listening to his people report, and he understood immediately that the board had shifted. The original plan had been clean. Oleander caused slow poisoning, left no trace on standard tests. The baby died. Doctors declared congenital heart failure or sudden infant death syndrome. Emilio collapsed. The main bloodline was cut, and Sal, the closest male relative, would slowly take control of the empire, while Emilio drowned in grief. Now, the baby lived. Doctors knew it was oleandrin. Emilio knew the plant was the cause, and there was a 10-year-old girl and her mother, two living witnesses sitting inside the estate, who had seen too much and said too much. And if Emilio started pulling the thread, it would lead from the plant to Grady, from Grady to Sal, and from Sal to the Ferrante family across the Hudson River, where Sal had been secretly negotiating for 2 years to divide territory after Emilio fell. Sal needed two things: time and silence. Time to erase remaining traces. Silence from the housekeeper and her daughter. On the second night after Nico was out of danger, Jo was washing dishes in the auxiliary kitchen at 11 o'clock at night, her shift running from 10 at night to 6 in the morning as always, because even if her daughter had just saved the boss's son, she was still a housekeeper, and dishes still needed washing, and floors still needed cleaning. She glanced out the kitchen window toward the small house where Willa slept, and saw something that froze her hands midstream. A figure standing in the dark corner behind her house, motionless, watching the window of Willa's room. The figure stood there for about 10 seconds, then melted back into the maple shadows, as if it had never been there. Jo finished the last dish with hands shaking so badly she nearly dropped it twice. Ended her shift half an hour early without asking permission. Ran home, locked the door, checked the windows, pulled the curtains, and sat on Willa's bed watching her sleep until dawn. She didn't sleep. She couldn't. Because every time she closed her eyes, she saw that figure standing in exactly the spot where it could see her daughter through the window. The next morning, after Willa left for school, Jo found it. A white envelope, no name, no address, slipped under the front door at some unknown time. Maybe at midnight. Maybe while Jo was running home from the kitchen. She didn't know, and not knowing was more frightening than knowing. Jo opened the envelope with hands shaking so badly she had to grip the paper with both hands. Inside were two things: a dried, pressed oleander flower, its petals still faintly yellow, its leaves still shaped exactly like the ones Willa had recognized on the nursery windowsill, and a white slip of paper written in black ink, all capitals, 5 words: "You should stay quiet." Jo stared at the dried flower and the note, and felt something collapse inside her. Not loudly, not dramatically, just a small crack like a bone breaking inside her chest, the sound of a woman who had spent her life running from an Appalachian Valley after Bryce, running from Bryce back to Dot, running from Dot to the Caruso estate, and now realizing that the place she thought was safe wasn't safe at all, that nowhere was safe, that being invisible wouldn't save her once someone decided to see her. Jo hid the envelope at the bottom of the wardrobe, picked Willa up from school, cooked dinner, helped with homework, read to her, turned off the light, and when Willa slept, Jo curled around her on the narrow single bed, holding her daughter with both arms as if someone might rip the child from her at any moment. And she shook, from spine to fingertips, shaking not from cold, even though the December night in Connecticut was freezing beyond the glass, but from fear, the most primal fear a mother can feel. Jo didn't sleep that night. At 4 in the morning, she decided. She rose, pulled the old suitcase from under the bed, began packing their clothes quietly so Willa wouldn't wake. She didn't know where they would go. She had no money, no family, no place in the world waiting for her. But she had her daughter, and her daughter was threatened. And for a mother, that was reason enough to step into the void. She finished packing at 5:30 in the morning, woke Willa, dressed her, took her hand, went to the door, opened it, and froze. Paxton Webb stood outside her house with 2 guards behind him, their breath forming white clouds in the cold early morning air, and he looked at the suitcase in Joe's hand, then into her eyes, and said, not as a question but as a statement, "Mr. Caruso wants to see you, right now." Joe had never set foot in the east wing of the main mansion before. For the past year working here, her world had consisted only of the auxiliary kitchen, the laundry room, the servants' corridors, and the small house at the edge of the estate, spaces designed so she could exist without ever touching anything that belonged to the Caruso family. Now Paxton led her down the main corridor for the first time, where the marble floor reflected her image, as if there were 2 Jolene Mercers walking side by side, one above and one below. Both afraid, both gripping their hands until their knuckles turned white. Willa was taken by a guard to the main kitchen for breakfast, and the moment her daughter disappeared from sight was the moment Joe felt as if someone had pulled her spine out of her body. Paxton stopped in front of a heavy oak door, knocked twice, opened it, and stepped aside. Joe went in. Emilio Caruso's office was darker than any room she had ever been in, not because it lacked light, but because everything in it absorbed it. Walls paneled in dark oak, black leather chairs, velvet curtains drawn tight, with only a narrow slit letting the early morning sun cut through the darkness like a blade. The room smelled of whiskey and expensive tobacco and leather and something else Joe couldn't name. Perhaps the scent of power, or danger, or both, because here the 2 were the same. Emilio sat behind his desk, white shirt sleeves rolled to his elbows, tie loosened, and for the first time Joe saw the Caruso crest tattooed on his right forearm, a black lion gripping a sword, the ink as sharp as a knife cut in skin. He didn't stand when she entered. He didn't offer her a seat. He only looked at her with the dark eyes Joe had seen in the corridor the day before, eyes that read people like books, and she felt herself being turned page by page. Everything she had hidden, every old bruise, every fear, every sleepless night, laid bare before him as if she were standing naked in the room, though she was fully dressed. Emilio placed something on the desk and slid it toward her, a white envelope. Joe recognized it instantly and her throat tightened, because it was the same envelope she had hidden at the bottom of her wardrobe less than 2 hours earlier. He already knew, before she did, or at the same time, or perhaps he had been watching her small house even before the shadow appeared. Joe didn't know. And she realized there were too many things here she didn't know, and not knowing made her feel as if she were standing in a minefield in the dark. Emilio spoke flatly. "The security cameras near your house recorded a man arriving at 11:17 last night, slipping the envelope under your door, then leaving toward the west service gate. Where were you planning to go with that suitcase?" Joe swallowed. She looked at the envelope on the desk, at the dried oleander inside, then back at Emilio, and she told the truth because she was too exhausted and too frightened to invent a lie. "I don't know. Anywhere. Just far from here." Silence followed. Emilio studied her for 3 more seconds, then spoke again, and when he did, his voice wasn't asking or offering, it was declaring, the voice of Caruso, issuing an order with no room for the word no. "You're not going anywhere. The person who sent this envelope wants my son dead, and wants your daughter silent. If you leave, how far do you think you'll get before they find you? You have no money, no place to go, no one to protect you. Out there, you and your daughter are moving targets. In here, you're under my protection." Something flared in Joe's chest. Not gratitude, not relief, but resistance. The resistance of a woman who had already let one man control her life once, and sworn it would never happen again, whether that man lived in a broken apartment or a 40-acre mansion. Joe spoke, her voice trembling but not weak. "I don't want to be part of your world. I don't want my daughter growing up among bodyguards and guns and threatening envelopes pushed under doors. I just want to live quietly. I just want Willa to be safe." Emilio looked at her, and this time Joe saw something shift in his eyes. Not much, just a thin glimmer, like the crack in the wall of ice she had glimpsed in the corridor when he told her to stand up, and he spoke more slowly, more softly, no longer the voice of a boss giving orders, but the voice of a man stating the simplest truth he knew. "You're already part of it, Jolene. From the moment your daughter saved my son's life, they moved that afternoon. Paxton sent 2 guards to the small house at the edge of the estate to help Joe carry their things. But there wasn't much to carry. 1 suitcase, a plastic bag of Willa's clothes, a shoebox holding a few old books, and the only photograph of Dot that Joe still had. And that was everything. The entire life of a mother and daughter reduced to 3 items a guard carried in one hand, without switching grips. The room Emilio gave them was in the west wing on the 2nd floor, close to Nico's nursery, and when Joe opened the door and stepped inside, she had to pause for a moment at the threshold, because the room was larger than the wooden house where she had grown up in Appalachia. A double bed with crisp white sheets, whose fabric Joe recognized immediately, because she had washed those same sheets for 3 years without ever lying on them. A private bathroom with a marble tub and gold-plated fixtures. A walk-in closet standing empty and waiting, so large Willa could stretch out on its floor without touching the walls. Windows overlooking the western gardens where the marble angel fountain poured water endlessly, meaninglessly, day and night. Willa walked a slow circle around the room, fingertips brushing the oak desk, the velvet curtains, the silver-framed mirror, touching everything as if checking whether it was real or just a stage set in a dream she might wake from at any moment. Then she turned back to Joe and said softly, in the voice of a 10-year-old trying to understand a world too large for her, "Mom, it's so beautiful here. But why does everything feel so cold?" Joe didn't know how to answer, because her daughter was right. Everything in that room was expensive, and everything was cold. Cold in the way spaces designed for display rather than living are cold. Cold. In the way the Caruso mansion was always cold, no matter how high the heat ran, because there were kinds of cold no heating system could touch. Joe hugged her daughter and said the only thing she knew to say whenever the world felt too big and she felt too small. "We'll be okay. We always are." But that first night on the wide bed with its white sheets, Joe lay awake staring at the high ceiling and felt like a bird locked inside a golden cage, and the feeling was nauseatingly familiar, because she had been caged before, in Bryce's apartment, in fear, in dependence. And now the cage was prettier, but still a cage, and she wondered whether her whole life was nothing more than moving from one cage to another without ever truly flying. On their 2nd day in the main mansion, Willa did something no one asked for, and no one stopped. She went to the nursery door, stood there looking in, and when the nurse on duty asked what she needed, Willa said she wanted to visit the baby. The nurse looked at the guard radioed Paxton. Paxton asked Emilio, and 15 seconds later, the answer came, "Let her in." Willa entered the nursery for the first time not through dirty glass from outside, but through the main door, and she walked straight to Nico's crib. The baby was much better, but still fussy, still crying at night, still unable to sleep peacefully despite the rotating team of nurses trying every technique in their manuals. Willa looked at Nico, and Nico looked at Willa, and she began to sing. Not a lullaby from a book, a song Dot had taught her. The song Dot sang to Joe, and Joe sang to Willa, and now Willa sang to Nico. A song about lavender fields on the hills, a stream running through the valley, a woman gathering herbs in the morning mist, a simple melody, plain words, a child's voice slightly off rhythm but warm in a way nothing in the Caruso mansion had ever been. And Nico stopped crying. The baby gazed at Willa with wide eyes, tiny hands reaching as if to touch the sound, and slowly, his eyes closed, his breathing evened, his chest rose and fell gently, asleep. The nurse on duty stared at Willa with her mouth slightly open, because she had spent the entire previous night trying to soothe Nico without success, and a 10-year-old girl had just done in 3 minutes what she couldn't do in 8 hours. From then on, Willa came to the nursery every day. In the morning before school, in the afternoon after returning, at night before bed. She sang to Nico, whispered to him about plants, held his hand when he fussed, and Nico was only truly calm when Willa was near, as if by some instinct he recognized that this girl was the one who had pulled him back from the edge, that this voice was the first he heard after surviving, and it became his anchor in a world too large and too cold. Joe stood at the nursery door watching her daughter sing to the son of a mafia boss, watching 2 children whose circumstances should never have allowed them to touch now lying close together, one singing and one listening, and Joe smiled, for the first time in a very long time. She couldn't remember the last time she had smiled. Maybe when Dot was still alive, maybe before Bryce, maybe in another lifetime. But now, she stood at the threshold between 2 worlds. The world of marble and crystal ahead, and the world of servants' corridors behind, and she smiled because her daughter was doing the thing Dot always said mattered most in life. Healing, not with medicine or money, but with presence, with being there when someone needs you, with seeing the child inside a person the world only sees as power and wealth. The first time it happened was on the 4th night after the two of them moved into the main mansion. Jo couldn't sleep. She rarely could, because the past year of night shifts had wrecked her internal clock so thoroughly that her body was now most awake at 2 in the morning, and she went down to the kitchen to make a cup of coffee, because coffee was the only reward she knew how to give herself without spending money, since the mansion kitchen always had coffee. She was standing by the counter, cradling the mug, eyes fixed on the dark garden beyond the window, when she heard footsteps. Not the footsteps of guards, because guards walked with machine-like rhythm, but slow, heavy steps, the steps of someone walking without a destination. And when Jo turned, Emilio Caruso was standing in the kitchen doorway, white shirt unbuttoned at the collar, an empty glass in his hand, and they looked at each other for about 3 seconds, 3 seconds longer than any conversation they had ever had. Emilio said nothing. He walked to the liquor cabinet, poured whiskey, then stood at the counter less than a meter from Jo, drank, looked out the same window she was looking through, and stayed silent. Jo drank coffee. Emilio drank whiskey. No one spoke a word. After 15 minutes, Emilio set the glass down and left, and Jo stayed 5 minutes longer listening to her heart beat faster than usual, without knowing why. The next night, same hour, same kitchen, same coffee and whiskey, same silence. But this time before leaving, Emilio spoke, not looking at her, eyes still on the window, asking what song the girl sang to Nico. Jo was so startled she nearly dropped the mug and answered that it was the song her great-grandmother taught her, about the lavender fields. Emilio nodded once and left. 4 words and 1 answer. That was all. But it was more than 3 years of silence before, and Jo felt something shift gently inside her, so faint she almost missed it, like the surface of a lake rippling from a pebble dropped far away. The nights that followed, the conversations grew longer by single sentences, 1 sentence at a time, slow and careful, like 2 people walking on thin ice knowing deep water waited below. Emilio asked about Dot, not politely, but specifically, like someone who genuinely wanted to understand, how she taught Willa to recognize plants, where the knowledge came from, how many people she treated, whether she ever wrote anything down. Jo told him, briefly at first, then longer still, because no one had asked about Dot in a long time, and when someone finally did, the memories spilled out like water through a broken dam. She spoke of the night Dot delivered Willa in the snow, of hands that smelled of lavender, of the way Dot bent over a sick plant and knew its illness before the leaves even wilted. Emilio listened. He listened with the absolute focus of a man used to analyzing information, but Jo sensed something beneath that focus, something like respect or genuine curiosity, or perhaps simply the loneliness of a man who had no one to talk to at 2 in the morning except a glass of whiskey. Then one night Jo asked about Celeste. She hadn't meant to. The question slipped out before her mind could stop it. Perhaps because it was 3 in the morning, and 3 in the morning blurred the line between what should and shouldn't be said. She asked what she was like. Just 3 words. Emilio didn't answer immediately. He looked down at his whiskey, slowly turning the glass, and Jo thought she had gone too far, touched something forbidden, and she was about to apologize when Emilio said that she was the only person who wasn't afraid of him. Silence followed. Then he added, more quietly, that he couldn't keep her. He said nothing more, and Jo didn't ask, because she understood that those 6 words were more than Emilio Caruso had said to anyone about Celeste since the night on Interstate 95, and she didn't want to break that moment with unnecessary speech. They stood in the dark kitchen less than a meter apart, not touching, but the air between them was thick like the moment before a storm, heavy and warm and full of something unnamed, and Jo felt it on her skin, on her wrists, at the back of her neck, a sensation she hadn't felt since before Bryce, before intimacy had been turned into a weapon. And feeling it now, here, with this man, frightened her and made her angry at herself at the same time. Then came the 12th night. Jo was passing the small study beside the master bedroom on her way back to her room from the kitchen, the door slightly open, and she glanced in by reflex, just a 1/10 of a second. But it was enough. Emilio was changing, his back to the door, and Jo saw it. Not the crest tattoo on his forearm she had seen in his office, But his back, a map of violence carved into flesh, a long scar slashing diagonally from left shoulder blade to lower back, pale and puckered, the mark of a knife or something sharper, 2 small round scars on his right side, clean and precise, old bullet wounds healed but never gone, and others she didn't have time to count because she turned away, quickly, walked on, but not quickly enough. In the mirror on the study wall, Emilio had seen her. Their eyes met through the glass, through reflection, not directly, as if both needed that thin barrier so the look wouldn't burn something they were both pretending didn't exist. Joe didn't stop. Emilio didn't call out. No one spoke, but when Joe reached her room, closed the door, leaned against the wood, she shut her eyes and saw the scars on his back printed on the inside of her lids like a negative image, and she understood that a boundary had shifted, that something had changed that night that couldn't be undone, that she had seen the most vulnerable part of a man who never let anyone see him vulnerable, and that it bound her to him with a thread she didn't want and couldn't cut. But the Caruso mansion wasn't made up only of quiet nights in the kitchen with coffee and whiskey and conversations that made Joe forget where she was. The Caruso mansion had another face, and that face began to reveal itself piece by piece, like beautiful paint peeling away to expose the rotting wall beneath. The first time was the phone call. 2 a.m, Joe was heading down to the kitchen as she did every night, and she heard Emilio's voice echoing from the soundproof office in the basement. The door left ajar that night because someone had forgotten to close it. She couldn't make out the words, only the rhythm, and that rhythm wasn't the rhythm of the man who asked her about Dot, or told her that Celeste was the only person who wasn't afraid of him. This rhythm was short, sharp, cold, every sentence like a bullet. And even though Joe didn't understand the content, she understood the tone. She understood because she had heard that tone in Bryce before he hit her. The tone of a man who was controlling violence rather than restraining it, and the difference between those two things was as thin as a blade. Joe turned back toward the kitchen and didn't go down to the basement. The second time was the blood. One early morning, Joe woke earlier than usual because Willa had kicked off her blanket in her sleep, and she stepped into the hallway just as Emilio came up from the eastern stairwell, the one that led up from the basement. He passed her, nodded slightly as always, but Joe saw it. A dark red smear on the right cuff of his white shirt, no bigger than a coin, but red in a way that couldn't be mistaken for anything but blood. Emilio realized she had seen it. He lowered his arm and pulled the cuff forward with a motion so natural it was almost unconscious. The motion of someone used to hiding bloodstains on their sleeves, and walked on without a word. Joe stood in the hallway watching him go, and she remembered how she used to pull long sleeves down over Bryce's bruises with that same instinctive motion, and the similarity made her nauseous. The third time was the sound. The sound came from the basement on a Thursday night, when Joe took a wrong turn in the hallway, because the mansion was so large, and she still wasn't used to navigating it at midnight. She turned right instead of left, and found herself in front of the soundproof door leading down to the basement, a door that should have been sealed shut, but that night was cracked open because someone had just passed through and hadn't closed it yet. And through that crack, Joe heard it. Not screaming. Worse than screaming. The sound of a man trying to speak through pain. Broken, muffled noises. Ragged breathing. A chair scraping across concrete. And beneath it all, Emilio's voice. Calm. Even. Asking something Joe couldn't hear clearly, but knew wasn't a polite question. Joe backed away. Quickly. Silently. Guided by the invisible instinct her mother had drilled into her bones since childhood, and she turned and walked fast back to her room, closed the door, sat on the bed, wrapped her arms around her knees, and breathed. Breathed and tried not to think about what she had just heard, but she couldn't not think, because 20 minutes later, she heard Emilio's footsteps passing her room in the hallway, slow and steady. The footsteps of a man who had finished his work, and she looked through the crack of the door, just a sliver, just enough to see him pass, and she saw his eyes. Emilio's eyes at 3 a.m. after coming up from the basement weren't the eyes that had looked at her through the mirror the night before with something soft and vulnerable beneath the ice. These eyes were cold, empty, completely black, like 2 bottomless wells where anyone who looked would see nothing but darkness. The eyes of a man who had just done something ordinary people couldn't do, and felt nothing afterward. And that lack of feeling was the most frightening thing of all. More frightening than Bryce's rage, because Bryce hurt her when he lost control, while Emilio did what he had just done in a state of absolute control. Joe closed the door, lay down beside Willa, and watched her daughter sleep. And in the darkness of the luxurious room, with white sheets and velvet curtains, She faced the truth she had been avoiding for 2 weeks. She had feelings for Emilio Caruso. Not gratitude, not fear, but something in between. Something hot and dangerous and that shouldn't exist. Something that began the night he told her to stand up and grew with every night in the kitchen and flared when she saw the scars on his back in the mirror.